Now, when we see them early on in this process, our goal is really to increase blood flow, increase circulation, because the better blood flow we get, the better the healing is, the more solid the recovery can be. And then, of course, when you're dealing with a 3-month rehab process on an injured tissue, if you're just resting for 3 months, now that muscle tissue that on your other leg that was healthy, or in your core or in your upper extremity or whatever that was healthy, is now going to be atrophying during that period because you're not using it as much. We've got a client right now, a CHP officer, and this is always the debate we have with like work comp issues, and they've been phenomenal for him, I have to say. But he's only he had a tibial fracture, and he's only about 4 weeks out now, coming up on his 5th week out, and he's able to weight bear and such on it, and he's moving really quite well. But the doctor told him, now be careful, don't go out and about and doing other things out in the world, because you could be seen as a negative thing, that you could go to work and do light duty and such. And he's like, well, I could go do light duty, but that means I'm not going to be doing my rehab. And I've got him in the gym where he's doing stuff on the bike, he's doing core work, he's doing upper body work, he's doing a pretty good amount of leg work, even despite the fracture, all to keep him healthy, because at the end of the day, a CHP officer or a police officer is an athlete. And it'd be one thing if we let him rest for 8 weeks. Sure, the bone would heal, he'd be all right, we'd do a little strength and he'd be okay, but to go back into an athletic performance event in a week or 2 weeks, and especially when you're in a squad car, then you got to get out and chase somebody, which is how he got hurt in the first place. You're just asking for problems, and the whole body becomes deconditioned. So this whole balance of tissue healing and then conditioning the system to rise to the occasion.
And that's really about mitigating collateral damage, right? Like mitigating the effect on the rest of the body. And so we have some tools that we use, I think, really effectively for that, like blood flow restriction, which I think we talked about on another podcast, but turns into a great way to encourage a tissue adaptation at a very low load to tissues that maybe aren't ready for those higher strain rates.
Right. I think a key element there that most people get the they get the knowledge set, or they get the instruction from maybe their physician or a surgeon, whoever it is, but they say this is your tissue timeline of healing. You get like 6 to 8 weeks to let this bone heal. You get 6 to 8 weeks to let this tendon heal, or this ligament heal, or whatever it is. Once you get to that time frame, things just get started. Like, you just allowed an initial tissue bed to lay down and exist. Now it's our job to train the tissue to be resilient against the forces it's going to experience in life or sport, and to develop probably the atrophied areas that we couldn't help change a whole heck of a lot just to allow healing. So I think there's a huge misconception of like, oh yeah, this is only an 8-week process. Like, nah, not necessarily. This is a let yourself heal and then the work begins.
You use the best word, resilient. Or another word that we use often is bulletproof. And to remind everyone, our bodies are quite elastic. Bone actually has a recoil. Bone is elastic, just has a much higher elastic modulus. Tendons have a really intense recoil, so they stretch quite a bit, and then they harness that energy and bring it back. Ligaments don't stretch as much. Maybe ligaments only stretch maybe 2% strain. Tendons might have upwards of 4 to 6 to 7 to 8% strain before they recoil. Nonetheless, we need elasticity, or else we get brittle. Brittle pieces of our body break again. So when people have an injury, they are 10 times more likely to be re-injured again. And part of that resiliency and becoming bulletproof is to stress the tissue to become like it was before. That's rehab. Yeah. So, I think as therapists, we tend not to use the word heal because it lacks good meaning. We say, are you ready for sport? Are you ready for action? Are you ready to get back to work? Are you ready to hike Mount Talac? We focus on the goal because that has some clarity to it, because now we need to stress the tissue for it to go through many iterations of stress, recover, which leads to stress adaptation to be able to do something that you couldn't do because of the injury, or maybe you got injured doing in the first place. But the big part of this healing, it does kind of like lack a little bit. I think healing maybe talks about the cross bridges that allow it to be stable under some stress, but the adaptation it takes to do something great, whole different game plan, and that takes months, if not upwards of 6 to 12 months, or even a year after some aggressive surgeries or really aggressive injuries.
Yeah.
So as we look at that's kind of tissue healing, is some aspect to look at from those specific tissues: bone, cartilage, tendon. We didn't really speak about muscle itself. If you have a mid-belly muscle strain, you have a tremendous amount of blood supply there, so usually this heals up quite rapidly. You should be recovering from that within a 2-month window, so kind of that 4 to 8 week window typically, depending on how large it was or how big the strain it was. That's if it's a true in the muscle belly, because there's when you see you hurt yourself and there's a bruise, that's actually a good sign, because that means there was blood there, right? And that means that there's fresh blood coming in, the healing rate will be much higher. Another tissue that we didn't really speak of, we talked much about cartilage, but ligament would kind of be in the same category, as it has a fair blood supply, and it really depends on the ligament in the body that you're stressing. Some have better ones than others. Some have the ability to heal up and stabilize, and some do not. So that's highly variable as well. But if it nonetheless, it's going to be on that kind of 12-week, 3-month type of timeline for that to I would say heal or stabilize. The ligaments aren't going to come back to what they once were. So if you strain it, you've strained it, and it's just going to kind of scar down as it is. So that's the difficult thing there. It's not going to recoil back like a tendon or a muscle tissue or a bone will actually evolve and change. And with ligaments, we don't see that same type of process. It tends to be is what it is. So that's why you see so much surgery on ligament reconstruction, is once it's stressed, it kind of has to be replaced or grafted essentially to fix it. Not to say there's other soft tissues that can support, but something certainly to be aware of. But in this light of tissue adaptation, I mean, this is what we do, is every day someone comes in and we ask ourselves, how much stress can this person tolerate? How much can I stress this tissue to get an adaptation response? Yeah. And so that depends on the phase. To Evan's point here is where we're at in this continuum of, if they're in an inflammatory or painful phase, then they probably aren't going to tolerate very much stress at all. They're already being stressed, just surviving. So we've got to calm that down and get that going. But then the next phase there would be to start to implement some stress to the tissue once it's out of the painful level, or it's decreasing its painful level. Let's start to stress it, and let's get it to adapt. And this has been very, very well documented about what's going on at a cellular level here when you stress and adapt tissue, and the map is quite clear. There's always variance from person to person, but essentially you're going to stress tissue progressively over time, and as you stress the tissue, you some degree break it down, you challenge it, and you're going to get a negative response at first, where you're going to get some soreness and some aches and pains and some irritation, but then you want to get an adaptation where it's like you tell the brain, like, hey, you're not strong enough, I need it to be stronger. So you demand it to move, and when you demand it to move, the brain's like, wow, that's a lot, I'm not ready for that. So then it says, okay, it's sore for a bit, but then it starts growing and developing new tissue. So the next time you come into that activity, it's a little bit thicker than it was before, it can tolerate a bit more, and then that just is continuously climbing, right? So that's stress and adaptation, and the rate at which that happens is what gets fun. That's what's really creative, and that's what really makes a great coach or a great clinician, is to understand how fast can I manipulate it. And frankly, it's person to person variable. Yeah. That's what's difficult about it.
And really, what are we manipulating, right? So you're going down the strength side of this thing. We could really go down a mobility side of this thing too. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about influencing tissue, we could be talking about influencing mobility or the tone in tissue, or we could be talking about strength. Since we're on strength, we got to decide what's creating the adaptation. There's really two versions of this. It's the structural version of things, and it's the neurological version of things. And when we look at adaptation over time, the first adaptations we see really aren't a structural change. It's making a true change in their strength, or hypertrophy changes are months down the road, weeks and months down the road, but you can make a neurological change in the moment. So a lot of the strength changes you see early on is a change in the nervous system, not the tissue itself.
But I think it's shorter lived too. So I think that's where we maybe fall victim to seeing the improvements in PT.
Yeah,
like you totally see those quick changes, you're like, oh sweet, we did our job, we got stronger, and you can face the forces of the earth, and I think that they're going to fall off the train on their commitment level when they leave your care, and those quicker changes that were made off of the neurological side of things, they're going to be shorter lived. I think about like an ACL rehab, or any type of injury that's kind of made you compensate through your legs, and maybe you have a thigh size that's a little bit different than a stronger side. When you plant your foot on the ground when you walk, that's at least 1 time your body weight, 1 to 2 times your body weight going through your thigh, or at least your entire lower extremity. When you run, that's like 7 to 10 times the amount. So it's not a neurological change that's going to give you the resilience against, say, someone that wants to get back into 5Ks and 10Ks, far beyond seeing you for the 6 to 8 weeks of time that you maybe saw them. You're going to need to create an actual structural change in their body to tolerate that for a long period of time and have some long-lasting effects. And I think that's where the PT kind of becomes in a little bit of an unknown area, because you got to know what that feels like, you got to know what it looks like, And you got to know certainly what type of commitment level it has to take to be able to get to that point.
So you speak to three things that I like to kind of like slow down a little bit and really kind of articulate. So we have a first and foremost of a neural adaptation. When you start patterning in a new way, you learn to activate your body better. Okay, so that's a neural adaptation. Think of it as the newbie really only knows how to activate 30% of that muscle system that allows them to move in that pattern. And as you do it over and over, you learn how to use 50%. 60%, 75% of what you actually have. So really the neural adaptation is better synergy through all of the muscles that allow you to move in that pattern. Then you do that repeatedly. That has a law of diminishing returns. You start getting into a little bit of a plateau there. And with repeat bouts of stress, you then get hypertrophy. So the hypertrophy, the body says, let's increase this muscular size to allow for more contraction force. That's going to be 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks of a fair amount of repetition, much more so than what they're used to. It's going to come with some soreness. It's going to come with more enhanced nutrition to allow for that hypertrophy phase. And sadly, the lowest one on the totem pole that's really the slowest to adapt is the tendons. And the tendon to handle that elastic energy and handle it healthy without being inflamed and being stable. And that adaptation, because of a weaker blood supply, is so much slower. And whether or not the tendon gets a little bit bigger or a little bit more dense, or maybe it just has stronger fibers in and of itself, is still kind of left to research to figure that part out. It's hard to know, but we know it takes a while.
But I think the point that both of you guys are driving home here is, so there's this order of how these things come about, and the neurological change happens quick, and that's when the PT's like, all right, party trick done, your pattern is different, you're good, see you later. But they miss that long-term development point. And I think for myself at least, one of the biggest learning experiences or biggest things that I took away from outside of school learning was learning from the strength and conditioning community, and learning about how we truly change tissue, because I didn't get that in school. So I had to go to, we had to go to the strength and conditioning community to learn how to actually create tissue adaptation over time. And then you said that tendons take longer, and so then that leads us down into the later part of our continuum and like rate of force development, because that's where that becomes important, that stretch shortening cycle for plyometric activities and speed and moving quickly.
That's it. That's why this shit takes a long time.
Yeah.
You gotta get some micro and macro periodization. If you want to do something phenomenal with your body, you got to be patient. You got to get in the reps. You have to sleep. You have to do all the things that we've talked about in so many ways to allow for the adaptation to occur.
And there's an order to it, and there's no shortcut.
Yeah.